The axe bit deep into seasoned oak, splitting the log clean through with a satisfying crack that echoed across the empty valley. Benjamin Carter wiped sweat from his brow despite the October chill, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air. The woodpile had grown considerably over the past week, stacked neat and high against the side of his cabin like a fortress wall against the coming winter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 41, Benjamin had learned that preparation was everything. The scar running from his left temple to his jawline served as a daily reminder of what happened when a man wasn't ready for trouble. 3 years had passed since he'd returned from the war, and he still woke some mornings expecting to hear bugles instead of birdsong, orders barked instead of wind through pine needles. His homestead sat tucked into a fold of the Cascade Mountains, 20 miles north of the small logging town of Millbrook, Oregon. The isolation suited him. No neighbors meant no questions about the nightmares that sometimes sent him stumbling onto the porch at midnight. No curious glances when he talked to his dog like the animal might actually answer back. Ranger, a grizzled mix of shepherd and something wilder, lay sprawled in a patch of sunlight near the cabin steps. The dog's ears twitched at every sound from the forest, but his eyes remained fixed on Benjamin with the unwavering loyalty of a creature who understood that some men needed watching over. The cabin itself was modest but solid, built with Benjamin's own hands from trees he'd felled on his property. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, windows that caught the morning light just right. It wasn't much, but it was his. After years of sleeping in army tents and makeshift shelters, having 4 walls and a roof that belonged to him felt like luxury enough. Benjamin split another log, then another. The repetitive motion helped quiet his mind, the same way chopping wood had helped him through those first difficult months after coming home. His neighbors in town thought him strange, the quiet veteran who came in once a month for supplies and spoke only when spoken to. They didn't understand that some silences were chosen, not imposed. A letter from his sister in San Francisco lay unopened on the kitchen table. Arrived 3 days ago with the monthly mail delivery. Margaret wrote faithfully, filling pages with news of her children, her husband's business ventures, the social gatherings that seemed to define her world. She always ended with the same gentle plea for him to visit, to consider moving closer to family, to stop hiding in the mountains like a wounded animal. Benjamin loved his sister, but he couldn't make her understand that he wasn't hiding. He was healing. There was a difference, though most people seemed incapable of recognizing it. The war had taken things from him that couldn't be replaced. Not just the obvious casualties, the friends who didn't make it home, the innocents that got buried in muddy trenches somewhere in France, but subtler losses too. His ability to sleep soundly, his comfort in crowded places, his faith that the world was fundamentally safe for good people trying to live quiet lives. But it had given him things too, though he rarely admitted this even to himself: patience, self-reliance, an appreciation for simple pleasures that peacetime folks took for granted. The way morning coffee tasted when you'd earned it through honest labor. The satisfaction of fixing something broken with your own hands. The profound quiet that came with knowing you could depend on yourself completely. His property stretched across 40 acres of mixed forest and meadow, with a creek running along the eastern boundary that provided fresh water year-round. He'd built the cabin on a slight rise that offered views down the valley while keeping him hidden from the main road that wound its way toward Millbrook. Travelers passed by occasionally, prospectors heading further into the mountains, merchants hauling goods between settlements, families seeking new opportunities in the Oregon Territory, but few had reason to turn up his narrow drive. Benjamin preferred it that way. He'd grown comfortable with his routines, his solitude, his small daily victories over the land. Each morning he rose before dawn, tended to his modest vegetable garden, checked his few head of cattle, repaired whatever needed fixing. Afternoons were for hunting or fishing, depending on the season. Evenings found him reading by lamplight, working on small carpentry projects, or simply sitting on his porch listening to the sounds of the forest settling into night. His wagon sat in the clearing between the cabin and the barn, a sturdy vehicle he'd built himself using plans from a book his sister had sent. The bed was lined with canvas and fitted with wooden slats that could support heavy loads of timber or supplies. He'd used it to haul materials for construction projects, to transport harvested crops to market, to carry the occasional piece of furniture he crafted for sale in town. The wagon represented freedom in a way that felt precious to someone who'd spent years taking orders, marching where he was told, fighting battles chosen by men who'd never held a rifle. With that wagon, he could go anywhere he pleased, carry whatever he needed, live according to his own schedule and nobody else's. Lately, though, he'd been thinking about expansion. Not of his property, 40 acres was plenty for one man, but of his purpose. The carpentry work brought in enough income to cover necessities, but he'd been considering taking on bigger projects. Maybe building furniture for the hotel in Millbrook, or constructing cabins for new settlers. The work would require more trips to town, more interaction with people, but it might also provide the sense of meaningful contribution he'd been missing. Benjamin set down his axe and gathered an armload of split wood, carrying it to the covered porch where it would stay dry through the winter months. Ranger followed, tail wagging lazily as if the short walk qualified as an adventure worth celebrating. Dog had appeared at his homestead 2 winters ago, half-starved and limping from what looked like a bear encounter. Benjamin had intended to patch him up and send him on his way, but Ranger had other plans. The animal simply refused to leave, establishing himself as a permanent resident with the quiet determination of a creature who'd found exactly where he belonged. In many ways, Ranger reminded Benjamin of himself. Scarred but resilient. Wary of strangers but fiercely loyal once trust was earned. Content with simple pleasures and suspicious of anything that disrupted the established order. They'd developed an easy partnership built on mutual respect and minimal conversation. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when Benjamin noticed something that made him pause mid-step. Ranger had gone rigid, ears pricked forward, nose testing the air with the intensity that usually meant visitors approaching. But the dog wasn't growling or barking, which ruled out predators or obvious threats. Benjamin listened carefully, filtering through the familiar sounds of wind and creaking timber for whatever had caught Ranger's attention. There, the distant sound of voices too far away to make out words, but close enough to confirm that people were traveling the main road below his property. Travelers weren't uncommon, especially in autumn when folks were making final preparations before winter set in. Most passed by without incident, focused on reaching their destinations before weather made the mountain roads impassable. But something about these voices felt different, though Benjamin couldn't immediately identify why. He moved closer to the edge of his property, where the trees thinned enough to provide a view of the road. Through the branches he could make out 3 riders moving slowly westward. Even at this distance, their posture suggested men accustomed to trouble, the kind of casual alertness that marked professional fighters or lawmen. Benjamin watched until they disappeared around a bend in the road, then returned to his wood splitting, with an uneasy feeling he couldn't quite shake. Ranger remained on guard for several more minutes before gradually relaxing, though his ears continued to twitch at every unexpected sound. The encounter, brief as it was, had disturbed the peaceful rhythm of Benjamin's afternoon. He found himself glancing toward the road more frequently, listening for sounds that didn't belong to his familiar mountain sanctuary. It was probably nothing. Travelers had every right to use the public road, and their presence didn't necessarily have anything to do with him or his property. But years of military service had taught him to trust his instincts, and those instincts were telling him that change was coming, whether he welcomed it or not. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He'd worked hard to build this life, this refuge where the past couldn't reach him, and the future could unfold at his own pace. Evening arrived with the sudden finality that marked mountain autumns. Benjamin finished securing his tools and made his way inside, Ranger padding along behind him. The cabin felt warm and welcoming after the day's labor, lamplight casting familiar shadows. Across walls lined with books and simple furniture, he prepared a modest supper of venison stew and cornbread, sharing portions with Ranger, who had earned his keep through loyal companionship if nothing else. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of logs in the fireplace and the distant call of an owl beginning its nightly hunt. Later, as Benjamin sat reading beside the fire, his mind kept wandering to those riders and the nameless unease their presence had triggered. He told himself he was being foolish, that isolation had made him overly cautious. But sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of distant voices calling through darkness, searching for something they'd lost and wouldn't stop hunting until they found it again. Outside, the mountain wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending leaves skittering across the porch like messages written in a language he'd forgotten how to read. Ranger whined softly in his sleep, legs twitching as if running from something only he could see. And in the morning, Benjamin would discover that sometimes the most profound changes arrive not with thunder and lightning, but with the simple sound of someone in desperate need calling out through the darkness for help that might never come. Benjamin woke to Ranger's low whimper, a sound that cut through his dreams like a blade through silk. The cabin lay shrouded in pre-dawn darkness, but something felt wrong. The dog stood pressed against the door, body tense with alertness that spoke of danger rather than mere curiosity. Benjamin slipped from his bed without lighting a lamp, moving by memory through the familiar space. His rifle hung above the mantel, loaded and ready as always. He lifted it down with practiced silence, checking the action by touch alone. Ranger's behavior suggested an immediate threat, not the casual interest he'd shown toward yesterday's passing riders. The front window offered a view of his property bathed in pale moonlight. Nothing moved in the clearing between the cabin and barn. The vegetable garden lay undisturbed. His small herd of cattle grazed peacefully in the distant pasture. Yet Ranger remained fixed on something beyond Benjamin's perception, every muscle coiled for action. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Benjamin eased the door open just wide enough to slip outside, bare feet finding purchase on the rough porch boards. The October air bit through his cotton shirt, raising goosebumps along his arms. He strained his ears for whatever had triggered Ranger's alarm, but heard only the familiar night sounds of wind through pine boughs and the distant hoot of a hunting owl. Then he caught it, a sound so faint he might have dismissed it as imagination, if not for Ranger's unwavering focus. A soft whimpering, almost like a wounded animal, coming from the direction of his wagon. Benjamin crept forward, rifle ready but not raised. The wagon sat where he'd left it the previous evening, positioned between two large oak trees that provided shelter from weather. Moonlight filtered through the branches, creating patterns of silver and shadow across the canvas-covered bed. As he drew closer, the whimpering grew more distinct. Not an animal after all, but something unmistakably human. A woman's voice, low and desperate, murmuring words he couldn't quite make out. Benjamin felt his heartbeat quicken, military instincts warring with civilian caution. He circled the wagon slowly, keeping to the shadows while trying to determine who might be hiding beneath the canvas and why. The voice came again, clearer, now speaking what sounded like gentle reassurances to someone or something that couldn't answer back. Benjamin positioned himself at the rear of the wagon where the canvas could be lifted without exposing himself to potential danger from within. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the fabric, Memories of wartime ambushes making every shadow suspect. The canvas parted to reveal a sight that stopped his breath entirely. A young woman lay curled in the wagon bed, her dark hair spread across a makeshift pillow of folded clothing. She couldn't have been more than 25, though exhaustion had carved lines around her eyes that spoke of trials beyond her years. Her dress, once fine quality, now showed tears and stains that told a story of desperate flight. But it was what she held that made Benjamin's heart clench with unexpected emotion. 2 infants, no more than a few months old, nestled against her body with the perfect trust that only babies could show. Twins by the look of them, wrapped in blankets that had seen better days but were clearly cherished. The woman's eyes fluttered open as moonlight fell across her face. For a moment, she simply stared at Benjamin with the dazed confusion of someone emerging from deep sleep. Then awareness flooded back, and she struggled to sit up while clutching the babies protectively against her chest. "Please," she whispered, voice hoarse with fatigue. "We're not thieves. I just needed somewhere safe for them to sleep." Benjamin lowered his rifle, though he didn't set it aside entirely. "How long have you been here?" "Since just after midnight." She shifted carefully to avoid disturbing the sleeping infants. "I saw your wagon from the road. It looked sheltered." Her accent carried the refined tones of education, marking her as someone who'd known better circumstances than her current situation suggested. Benjamin found himself studying her face in the moonlight, searching for signs of deception or danger. He saw only exhaustion and fierce maternal protectiveness. "You alone?" he asked. The woman hesitated before nodding. "Just us 3. Benjamin glanced toward the main road, then back at his unexpected guests. Questions multiplied in his mind, but years of mountain solitude had taught him patience. Stories revealed themselves in their own time, usually when folks felt safe enough to share them. "You hurt?" "No." She touched her cheek where a faint bruise colored the skin. "Not anymore." The bruise looked recent, purple-black against pale skin. Benjamin's jaw tightened as he recognized the distinctive mark of a man's knuckles. He'd seen enough violence to know its signature. One of the babies stirred, making soft mewing sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the mountain stillness. The woman immediately began rocking, humming a wordless melody that gradually soothed the infant back to sleep. Her movements carried the automatic grace of someone who'd performed this ritual countless times. "They hungry?" Benjamin asked. "They were. I fed them what I could." Her voice carried embarrassment mixed with defiance. "I know it's not proper, a stranger using your property without permission, but they needed rest, and the nights are getting so cold." Benjamin looked at the thin blankets wrapped around the babies, then at the woman's inadequate clothing. No coat, no proper winter garments, nothing suited for mountain weather. Whatever had driven her from her previous situation, she'd left with barely more than the clothes on her back. "What are you planning to do come morning?" "Keep traveling west. I heard there might be work in the lumber camps near the coast. Women cook and clean, help with the injured." She straightened slightly, as if trying to project confidence she clearly didn't feel. "I can work. I'm not looking for charity." Benjamin nodded slowly. Pride was something he understood, having clung to his own during the difficult months after returning from war. But pride could be a luxury that parents with hungry children couldn't afford. "You got names?" Sarah Mitchell." She looked down at the sleeping babies. "And these are my daughters, Emma and Lucy. I'm Benjamin Carter. This is my land." Sarah's shoulders tensed, preparing for whatever judgment or demands might follow. Benjamin saw the fear flicker across her features, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. "The wagon's dry," he said finally. "Warmer than sleeping in the open." Relief flooded Sarah's face before she could hide it. "Thank you. We'll be gone at first. Light, I promise." Benjamin studied the babies, so small and vulnerable in their mother's arms. Military experience had taught him to assess situations quickly, identify threats and opportunities, make decisions based on available information, rather than emotional impulses. But looking at those sleeping infants, he felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with tactical considerations. "Mountain roads are dangerous this time of year," he said. "Weather can change fast, catching travelers unprepared." Sarah nodded, though her expression suggested she understood the risks but saw no alternative. "You eaten recently?" The question seemed to surprise her. She hesitated before shaking her head. "Yesterday. Some bread and cheese I bought in the last town." Benjamin felt his decision crystallizing, though he couldn't entirely explain why. Perhaps it was the way she held her children, with fierce love. That reminded him of his own mother's protection during his childhood. Maybe it was the bruise on her cheek that spoke of cruelties no woman should endure. Or possibly it was simply the recognition of someone who'd reached the end of their resources and refused to give up. "I've got coffee on the stove," he said, "and leftover stew from supper." Sarah stared at him as if the offer might be some kind of trap. "I don't have money to pay you. Didn't ask for any." "Then why?" Benjamin considered the question, searching for an answer that would make sense to both of them. The truth was complex, part military instinct to protect civilians, part recognition of his own loneliness, part simple human decency that his mother had instilled in him years ago. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. Sarah's eyes filled with tears she clearly didn't want to shed. I'm not what you might think. I'm not a loose woman or a criminal. I just ... I had to leave. None of my business. Unless you choose to make it so." The response seemed to surprise her again. She looked down at her daughters, then back at Benjamin. "They're all I have left. They're lucky to have a mother willing to fight for them." Something in his tone seemed to reach her, breaking through the defensive walls she'd built around her situation. Her shoulders sagged slightly as exhaustion caught up with the adrenaline that had kept her alert through the night. "The offer of food stands," Benjamin said, "but I won't press it. Your choice." Sarah looked at the babies, then at the pre-dawn darkness beyond the wagon. The temperature was dropping as morning approached, and the thin blankets that had sufficed during warmer weather would provide little protection against mountain cold. Could I bring them inside? Just until the sun comes up, and it warms a little, of course." Benjamin helped her climb down from the wagon, careful not to jostle the sleeping infants. Sarah moved stiffly, favoring her left side in a way that suggested more injuries than the visible bruise on her face. She'd clearly been through an ordeal that involved more than simple travel hardships. Ranger approached cautiously, tail wagging low as he sensed Benjamin's acceptance of the newcomers. Sarah tensed at first, but relaxed when the dog simply sniffed curiously at the blankets wrapped around the babies before settling nearby with protective alertness. "He's friendly, Benjamin," assured her. "Good with children." Sarah nodded, though her grip on the infants remained protective. They made their way toward the cabin, 3 adults and 2 babies moving through moonlight like refugees seeking sanctuary. Benjamin held the door open, gesturing for Sarah to enter first. She paused on the threshold, perhaps realizing that accepting his hospitality would mark a point of no return. Whatever fears or doubts drove her flight, bringing her children into a stranger's home represented a leap of faith that circumstances had forced upon her. "It's warm inside," Benjamin said gently. "Safe." Sarah stepped across the threshold, carrying her daughters into lamplight and shelter. Behind them, Ranger padded through the door with the satisfaction of a guardian whose vigil had successfully protected those under his care. The cabin seemed smaller with visitors, but not uncomfortably so. Sarah stood near the door, still ready to flee if necessary, while Benjamin moved to stoke the fire and light additional lamps. The babies stirred at the increased warmth and brightness, making small sounds that suggested they might wake soon. "There's a chair by the fire," Benjamin said, indicating his best piece of furniture, more comfortable than standing. Sarah moved carefully to the offered chair, settling the babies in her lap with practiced ease. The firelight revealed details that moonlight had hidden, the quality of her dress despite its current condition, the careful way she'd arranged her hair despite obvious haste, the small gold locket at her throat that suggested better times. Benjamin busied himself preparing coffee and reheating the previous evening's stew, giving Sarah time to adjust to her new surroundings. He could feel her watching him, assessing whether his apparent kindness masked darker intentions. The caution was wise, given her circumstances and the obvious evidence that someone had already betrayed her trust. "How old are they?" he asked, nodding toward the babies. 4 months next week." Sarah's voice carried the mixture of pride and worry that seemed to define new motherhood. "Emma was born first, then Lucy about 10 minutes later. Strong babies to survive mountain travel. Stronger than I expected." Sarah looked down at her daughters with fierce love. "They've been so good, barely crying even when they must be cold. Or hungry." Benjamin set a cup of coffee on the small table beside her chair, steam rising in fragrant spirals. Sarah inhaled deeply, as if the smell alone provided nourishment. "When did you last have a proper meal?" Sarah considered the question, fatigue making simple calculations difficult. 2 days ago, I think. In Bend, I bought supplies, but..." She trailed off, perhaps realizing how much her answer revealed about her desperate circumstances. Benjamin ladled stew into a bowl, adding a thick slice of bread he'd baked the previous day. He set both within easy reach of Sarah's chair, then retreated to give her space. Experience had taught him that kindness could be as overwhelming as cruelty for someone. Unaccustomed to either. Sarah stared at the food as if unsure whether it was real. Then hunger overcame caution, and she began eating with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned not to waste opportunities for nourishment. The babies woke gradually, making soft sounds that grew more insistent as they fully emerged from sleep. Sarah immediately shifted to accommodate their needs, balancing the bowl of stew while preparing to nurse the infants. They need to eat," she said, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Privacy's yours if you need it," Benjamin said. "I can step outside." Sarah looked surprised by the offer. "You don't have to leave your own home. Seems like the right thing to do." But Sarah shook her head, some internal decision made. "You've been kind. More than kind. I trust you." The words carried weight that went beyond their simple meaning. Trust was clearly something Sarah didn't offer lightly, given recent experience. Benjamin felt the responsibility of that gift settle on his shoulders like a mantle he'd worn before, but had almost forgotten. As Sarah tended to her daughters, Benjamin found himself thinking about the riders he'd seen the previous day. 3 men moving with purpose, scanning the countryside as if searching for something specific. Or someone. The timing seemed too coincidental to ignore. Sarah and her babies had been traveling these roads around the same time those riders had passed through. If they were connected, if someone was hunting this small family, then Benjamin's quiet mountain sanctuary was about to become considerably more complicated. But as he watched, Sarah gentled her babies with tired hands and heard her humming soft lullabies that spoke of love beyond measure. Benjamin realized that some complications were worth accepting. Some fights were worth having, even when you hadn't chosen them yourself. Outside, dawn was beginning to touch the eastern peaks with pale gold light. Soon the sun would rise fully, revealing whatever truths the day might bring. For now, though, there was warmth and food and safety, small mercies that felt precious in their simplicity. Benjamin settled into his rocking chair with his own cup of coffee. Ranger curled at his feet and prepared to discover what else fate might deliver to his doorstep. The morning sun climbed higher over the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across Benjamin's property as he worked to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by falling branches during the last storm. Sarah had insisted on helping despite his protests, settling the twins in a makeshift cradle fashioned from an old wooden crate lined with soft blankets. "You don't need to do this," Benjamin had told her earlier as she gathered the scattered fence posts. "You're a guest here. Guests don't stay 3 days and eat your food without contributing something," Sarah replied, hefting a post with surprising strength. "Besides, I know how to work. My father believed in teaching all his children useful skills, not just the boys. 3 days." Benjamin still marveled at how quickly his solitary routine had adapted to accommodate 3 additional residents. Sarah had proven herself remarkably capable, taking on tasks without being asked and demonstrating a practical intelligence that spoke of good upbringing and hard experience. She'd also proven to be a devoted mother whose entire world revolved around Emma and Lucy. Benjamin watched her now as she worked, one eye always on the babies who gurgled contentedly in their improvised bed. Every few minutes she'd pause to check on them, adjust their blankets, or simply touch their tiny hands as if reassuring herself they were safe. "Your father sounds like a practical man," Benjamin said, holding a fence post steady while Sarah positioned the connecting rail. He was Samuel Harrison, owned the largest mercantile in Sacramento. Said if his children were going to inherit the business, they needed to understand every aspect of it, from inventory to bookkeeping to loading wagons. Sarah's voice carried fondness mixed with something darker. "He died 2 years ago. Consumption took him fast." Benjamin nodded, recognizing the particular grief that came with sudden loss. "Must have been hard running a business alone." "I didn't run it alone." Sarah's hand stilled on the fence rail. "My father had arranged for me to marry his business partner. Said it would keep everything in the family, ensure the mercantile stayed prosperous." The bitter edge in her voice told Benjamin more than her words did. He waited, sensing she needed to tell this story at her own pace. "Marcus Whitmore was 15 years older than me, a widower with grown children who didn't approve of their father taking a young wife." Sarah resumed working, but her movements had grown mechanical. The arrangement made sense financially. Marcus got a wife and full ownership of the business. I got security and social standing, but not happiness. Sarah's laugh held no humor. Happiness wasn't part of the arrangement. Marcus made that clear from the beginning. I was expected to be grateful, compliant, and above all, quiet about anything that happened behind closed doors. Benjamin felt his jaw tighten as he began to understand the source of the bruise he'd seen that first night. "He hurt you." "Not at first. The first few months he was almost kind. Distant, but respectful enough. Things changed when I told him I was carrying twins." Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He said one baby was acceptable, even desirable for his legacy. But twins meant complications, extra expense, divided attention. He wanted me to find someone who could make the problem smaller." Benjamin's hands clenched around the fence post. He'd heard whispered stories about women who visited certain doctors in back rooms, who took dangerous herbs to end unwanted pregnancies. The thought of anyone pressuring Sarah toward such desperation made his vision blur with anger. "I refused," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "I told him these babies were God's gift, not a problem to be solved. That's when he showed me what kind of man he really was." She pushed up her sleeve, revealing faded bruises on her forearm in the distinct pattern of finger marks. Benjamin had seen similar injuries on fellow soldiers who'd been roughly handled during interrogations. It got worse after the girls were born. Marcus said they cried too much, demanded too much attention, cost too much money. He wanted me to give them to an orphanage, said we could try again for a son who wouldn't be in such trouble. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "When I refused again, he said he'd find other ways to solve the problem." Benjamin set down his tools, giving Sarah his full attention. "What kind of ways?" "He had connections with men who bought and sold children for labor. Said twin girls would bring a good price from families who needed domestic help but couldn't afford to pay wages. Sarah's hands trembled as she spoke. He gave me 1 week to change my mind. Said if I didn't agree to the arrangement, he'd simply wait until I was out of the house and handle the matter himself. The casual evil of such a plan left Benjamin speechless for a moment. He'd seen cruelty during the war, witnessed what humans could do to each other when civilized restraints fell away. But the idea of a man selling his own wife's children like livestock struck him as particularly monstrous. So you ran. I took what I could carry and left in the middle of the night. Marcus was visiting business associates in San Francisco, wouldn't return for 3 days. I thought I had enough head start to reach Oregon territory before he realized we were gone. Sarah's voice grew bitter. I underestimated his connections. Benjamin glanced toward the main road, remembering the 3 riders he'd seen several days ago. He sent men after you. Professional bounty hunters. Marcus has enough money to hire the best. Sarah followed his gaze. They're probably still out there, checking every town and farm between here and the coast. Marcus won't give up easily. I represent too much money and damaged pride. What happens if they find you? Sarah's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. Marcus will claim I stole his property, meaning the girls. He has legal papers showing he's their father, witnesses who'll testify to my unstable mental condition. The law will side with a respectable businessman over a runaway wife with no resources. Benjamin absorbed this information, understanding now why Sarah had been so cautious about trusting him. In her world, men in positions of power had repeatedly betrayed that trust for their own advantage. Emma began to fuss, her cries cutting through the morning air with the urgency that only hungry babies could achieve. Sarah immediately dropped her tools and moved to the cradle, lifting her daughter with practiced ease. I should feed them, she said apologetically. They're getting hungry again. No need to apologize. They're babies. Benjamin gathered the scattered tools. I'll finish up here. But Sarah shook her head. We can finish together after they're settled. I don't like leaving tasks half done. It was a small thing, but Benjamin found himself appreciating her attitude toward shared work. Too many people in his experience were quick to abandon responsibilities when personal needs arose. Sarah's determination to complete what she'd started spoke well of her character. They moved to the cabin porch where Sarah could nurse the babies while still helping. Benjamin organized the tools and planned the afternoon's work. Lucy had woken by then as well, adding her voice to Emma's increasingly insistent demands for attention. They're getting stronger, Benjamin observed as Sarah managed both infants with remarkable efficiency. Louder anyway, much louder than when we first arrived. I think the regular meals and warm shelter are helping them thrive. Sarah smiled down at her daughters. They've never had such a peaceful place to grow. Benjamin felt something tighten in his chest at the casual way she described his property as peaceful. For 3 years he'd thought of his homestead as a refuge for himself alone, a place to heal away from the world's complications. But watching Sarah with her babies, seeing how they'd settled into his routine without disrupting its essential rhythms, he was beginning to understand that some kinds of peace were meant to be shared. What were you planning to do once you reached the coast? He asked. Find work in the lumber camps like I told you. But I've been thinking. Sarah hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. The men who are hunting us won't expect me to stop traveling. They'll assume I'm still heading west, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and Sacramento. You're thinking of staying put somewhere. Maybe, if I could find a place that felt safe enough. Sarah looked around at the mountains surrounding them. Somewhere isolated enough that strangers would be noticed, but with good people who might be willing to help a woman in trouble. Benjamin understood what she wasn't quite asking. The idea of permanent guests hadn't occurred to him when he'd first offered her temporary shelter. But as the days had passed, He'd found himself noticing how much livelier the cabin felt, with voices other than his own echoing off the walls. "The closest neighbors are 5 miles away," he said carefully. "Mail comes once a month. Winter will close the mountain roads for weeks at a time. I'm not afraid of isolation. I've learned to be comfortable with my own company." Sarah adjusted Emma's position. "But I won't impose on your kindness indefinitely. You didn't choose to become responsible for a woman and 2 babies." "No," Benjamin agreed. "I didn't choose it, but that doesn't mean I regret it." Sarah looked up at him with surprise. "You don't?" Benjamin considered his words carefully. The truth was complex, involving emotions he wasn't entirely comfortable acknowledging. For 3 years, he'd convinced himself that solitude was what he needed, that human connection brought complications he wasn't ready to handle. But Sarah and her babies had slipped into his life without demanding dramatic changes or emotional declarations. They'd simply made his daily routines more meaningful, given purpose to tasks that had become merely habitual. "The war taught me to value good company when I found it," he said finally. "You're good company, Sarah, you and the girls." Something shifted in Sarah's expression, a cautious hope that she was clearly trying not to embrace too quickly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you don't have to keep running unless you want to. This place has room for a family if you think you could be happy here." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, emotions playing across her face too quickly for him to interpret. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You'd do that? Let us stay permanently?" "I'd like that," Benjamin said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "More than I expected." Sarah's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. "I don't know what to say. After everything that's happened, everything I've lost, I didn't think I'd ever feel safe anywhere again. You're safe here. But what if Marcus finds us? What if those men come here looking for me? I won't let you get hurt because of my problems." Benjamin thought about the rifle above his mantel, the military training that had never quite faded, the protective instincts that Sarah and her babies had awakened in him. Some fights were worth having, especially when they involved defending people who couldn't defend themselves. "Let me worry about that," he said. "You focus on taking care of yourself and the girls." Sarah nodded slowly, though her expression remained troubled. "There's something else you should know, something I haven't told you about Marcus." Benjamin waited, sensing this revelation would be significant. "He's not just wealthy and connected. He has a violent temper and enough money to indulge it without consequences. The men he hired to find me, they're not just bounty hunters. They're killers." Sarah's voice grew urgent. "If they come here, they won't just take me back to Sacramento. They'll eliminate anyone they see as a threat or weakness." The warning sent ice through Benjamin's veins, but not from fear. From recognition. He'd faced killers before, during the war and in its chaotic aftermath. The prospect of violence didn't terrify him as much as the thought of failing to protect the family that had somehow become his responsibility. "Then we'll have to make sure they don't find you," he said. Sarah searched his face, perhaps looking for signs of doubt or second thoughts. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her, because her shoulders relaxed slightly. "How?" Benjamin smiled grimly, feeling old instincts stirring to life. "By being smarter than they are. And by making this mountain the last place they'll want to stay." As if summoned by his words, Ranger lifted his head from where he'd been dozing in the afternoon sun. The dog's ears pricked forward, alert to some sound or scent that human senses couldn't detect. Benjamin felt his muscles tense automatically, years of military training bringing him to instant readiness. Beside him, Sarah noticed the change in both man and dog, instinctively drawing her babies closer to her chest. "What is it?" she whispered. Benjamin held up a hand for silence, listening intently to the mountain stillness. There, the distant sound of hoofbeats on the main road, growing closer rather than passing by. "Company," he said quietly. "Get the Babies inside. Sarah rose swiftly, carrying Emma and Lucy toward the cabin door. Benjamin moved to follow, then paused as Ranger's low growl confirmed what his instincts had already told him. These weren't ordinary travelers passing through. These were riders with purpose, following a trail that led directly to his mountain sanctuary. The hunt had finally arrived at their door. Benjamin moved with practiced stealth toward the edge of his property, staying within the tree line while keeping the main road in view. The hoofbeats had stopped just beyond the bend where his private drive branched off from the public thoroughfare. Whoever had arrived was taking time to assess the situation before making their presence known. Through the pine branches, he could see 3 men on horseback, their postures radiating the confidence of professionals accustomed to getting their way. The leader, a tall man with graying temples and expensive riding clothes, gestured toward Benjamin's cabin while speaking in low tones to his companions. Even at this distance, Benjamin could see the gun belts slung around their waists and the purposeful way they scanned the surrounding terrain. These weren't lost travelers seeking directions. They were hunters who'd found their quarry. Benjamin crept back toward the cabin, his mind already formulating defensive strategies. The building's position offered both advantages and vulnerabilities. Set on higher ground, it provided clear sight lines in all directions, but it also left them exposed to anyone approaching from the valley below. The thick log walls would stop most small arms fire, but 3 armed men could easily surround the structure and wait for their targets to emerge. Sarah met him at the door, her face pale but composed. She'd wrapped the babies in traveling blankets and gathered what few possessions she could carry quickly. Her hands shook slightly, but her voice remained steady. How many? 3, professional types, well armed. Benjamin moved to the gun cabinet, removing his rifle and a shotgun along with ammunition for both. They're still on the road, probably deciding how to approach. It's them, isn't it? Marcus's men. Benjamin nodded grimly. Has to be. The timing's too convenient otherwise. Sarah sank into the rocking chair, clutching her daughters against her chest. I should never have stayed. I've brought this down on you, put you in danger because of my problems. Stop. Benjamin's voice was firm enough to cut through her rising panic. We talked about this. You belong here now, all 3 of you. That means we face whatever comes together. But they'll kill you if you try to protect us. Marcus doesn't leave loose ends. Benjamin checked the rifle's action, muscle memory from countless military inspections guiding his movements. Then we'll have to make sure they don't get the chance. A new sound reached them from outside, the creak of leather and jingle of harness as horses moved closer. The riders had apparently finished their reconnaissance and decided to make their approach. Ranger's growl grew deeper, his hackles rising as he positioned himself between the door and the family he'd adopted. Take the babies to the back room, Benjamin instructed. Stay away from the windows, keep low, and don't come out until I tell you it's safe. Sarah rose unsteadily, then paused. Benjamin, if something happens to me, promise you'll take care of them. Don't let Marcus get his hands on my girls. The desperate love in her voice hit Benjamin like a physical blow. He crossed to her in 3 quick strides, placing his hands gently on her shoulders while being careful not to disturb the sleeping infants. Nothing's going to happen to you, he said with quiet conviction. I won't let it. Sarah searched his face, perhaps looking for false bravado or empty reassurance. Whatever she saw there seemed to give her strength, because she nodded once and headed toward the bedroom with her daughters. Benjamin positioned himself near the front window where he could observe the approaching riders while remaining partially concealed. They came up his drive slowly, 3 abreast, projecting the casual menace of men accustomed to intimidating their way to success. The leader raised his hand when they reached the clearing, bringing the small group to a halt just outside rifle range. Hello, the house, the man called out. his voice carrying the refined accent of education and privilege. "We're looking for a woman traveling with twin babies. We'd like to speak with the property owner." Benjamin remained silent, studying the trio through his window. The leader appeared to be in his 50s, well-dressed despite the rigors of mountain travel. His companions were younger, harder-looking men with the lean builds and alert eyes of professional gunfighters. All three carried themselves with the confidence of people who rarely encountered serious resistance. "We know you're in there, friend," the leader continued when no response came. "We're not looking for trouble, just trying to locate a missing woman and her children. There's a substantial reward for information leading to their safe return." The reasonable tone didn't fool Benjamin for an instant. He'd heard similar speeches from Confederate officers, trying to extract information from captured Union soldiers. Reasonable words backed by implied violence were still threats, no matter how politely delivered. "We represent Marcus Whitmore of Sacramento," the man went on. "Perhaps you've heard of him? Prominent businessman, pillar of the community. His wife suffered a mental breakdown after childbirth and fled with his infant daughters. The poor woman isn't thinking clearly, might not even remember her own name. We're here to bring her and the babies home safely." Benjamin felt his jaw clench at the skillful manipulation. To anyone who didn't know the truth, the story sounded perfectly reasonable. A wealthy man's unstable wife, dangerous to herself and her children, rescued by concerned relatives and medical professionals. It was exactly the kind of narrative that would gain sympathy from local authorities and justify whatever methods these men chose to employ. One of the younger riders leaned toward his leader, speaking too quietly for Benjamin to overhear. The older man nodded, then addressed the cabin again. "We have reason to believe the woman might be here. A merchant in Millbrook mentioned seeing a young mother with twins asking about work in the lumber camps. The timeline fits with her disappearance. From Sacramento." Benjamin cursed silently. Sarah had been careful during their supply runs to town, but small communities were notorious for gossip. Someone had noticed her, remembered her story, and shared it with the wrong people. "Now, we understand you might feel protective of what seems like a woman in distress," the leader continued. "That speaks well of your character. But this is a family matter, and we have legal authority to retrieve Mr. Whitmore's property." The casual way he referred to Sarah and her babies as property made Benjamin's trigger finger itch. But he forced himself to remain calm, to think tactically rather than emotionally. 3 armed men in open ground held advantages that impulsive action would only squander. "We're prepared to compensate you for any inconvenience," the man added. "Mr. Whitmore is a generous man who appreciates discretion in delicate family matters." When silence continued to be the only response from the cabin, the leader's tone began to harden. "Of course, if you're harboring a fugitive against her husband's legal wishes, that could be seen as kidnapping. A serious crime with serious consequences." Benjamin shifted position slightly, ensuring he had clear shots at all 3 riders if negotiations broke down completely. The military part of his mind was already calculating angles, cover positions, and probable responses to various tactical scenarios. "I'm going to dismount and approach the house," the leader announced. "I'd appreciate it if you'd step outside so we can discuss this like civilized men." The rider swung down from his horse with fluid grace, his hand resting casually on his gun butt as he approached the porch. Up close, Benjamin could see the man's face more clearly, aristocratic features, marked by the kind of cold intelligence that valued results over methods. "My name is Vincent Kane," the man called out as he mounted the porch steps. "I'm a private investigator licensed in 3 states, hired by Mr. Whitmore to locate his missing family. I have legal documents authorizing me to take custody of Sarah Whitmore and her children." Kane paused at the door, clearly expecting it to open. When it didn't, he tried the handle and found it barred from within. His expression shifted slightly, politeness giving way to something more predatory. "I can see you're inside, friend. The smart thing would be to open this door, and let's talk this through reasonably. Mr. Whitmore's reach extends far beyond California. He has friends in the territorial government, connections with federal marshals. Making an enemy of him would be ... unwise." Benjamin remained motionless, waiting to see how far Cain would push before revealing his true nature. The man's veneer of civilization was already beginning to crack under the stress of unexpected resistance. "You're protecting a mentally unstable woman who's stolen 2 innocent babies from their father," Cain continued, his voice hardening. "Every day she remains missing increases the danger to those children. Are you really willing to be responsible for what might happen to them?" The manipulation was expertly crafted, designed to create doubt and guilt in anyone who might be wavering. But Benjamin had heard Sarah's story, seen the bruises on her body, witnessed the terror in her eyes when she spoke of her husband's threats. He knew exactly what kind of danger those babies faced, and it wasn't from their mother. Cain stepped back from the door, his patience apparently exhausted. He gestured toward his mounted companions, and Benjamin saw them begin to spread out, flanking the cabin from both sides. The time for talk was ending. "This is your last chance to be reasonable," Cain called out. "Open the door and turn over the woman and children, and you can walk away from this with Mr. Whitmore's gratitude and a substantial payment. Continue to interfere, and things will become unpleasant for everyone involved." Benjamin finally moved, stepping into view at the window with his rifle clearly visible. Cain's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon before stopping, his eyes calculating the distance and angles involved. "The woman and children are under my protection," Benjamin said quietly, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who'd made his final decision. "They're not going anywhere they don't want to go." Cain's facade finally dropped completely, revealing the cold professionalism beneath. "You're making a serious mistake, friend. We came here hoping to resolve this quietly, but we're prepared for other options, so am I." The 2 men stared at each other through the window glass, each taking the measure of his opponent. Cain saw a mountain man with military bearing and steady hands, potentially dangerous but presumably inexperienced in the kind of warfare he and his companions specialized in. Benjamin saw a predator who'd grown comfortable with easy prey and might not be prepared for serious resistance. "You can't stay barricaded in there forever," Cain said. "We have time, supplies, and patience. Eventually you'll have to come out, and when you do, we'll be waiting." Benjamin said nothing, but his meaning was clear. Cain nodded slowly, apparently accepting that negotiation had failed. "Have it your way. But remember, whatever happens next, you brought it on yourself." Cain backed away from the cabin, rejoining his mounted companions at the edge of the clearing. Benjamin watched through the window as the 3 men conferred, in low voices, occasionally glancing toward the cabin as they formulated their strategy. From the back room came the soft sound of one of the babies beginning to fuss, followed by Sarah's gentle voice singing a wordless lullaby. The contrast between that tender sound and the deadly tension outside struck Benjamin with unexpected force. This was what he was fighting for, not just Sarah's freedom or the baby's safety, but the right of good people to live without fear of predators who saw human lives as commodities to be bought and sold. Cain and his men were settling in for a siege, positioning themselves where they could watch the cabin while remaining in cover. They'd apparently decided that time was on their side, that hunger and thirst would eventually force their quarry into the open. They were about to learn that some mountains held more dangers than they'd anticipated, and that a man protecting his family could be far more resourceful than they'd imagined. Benjamin checked his weapons one final time, then began to implement the defensive plan that was already forming in his mind. The war had taught him many things, but perhaps the most important was this: when fighting for something truly precious, Retreat was never an option. Outside, the sun continued its arc across the October sky, marking time in a confrontation that could only end with one side victorious and the other destroyed. The mountain held its breath, waiting to see which kind of strength would prove more powerful, the cold calculation of professional killers, or the fierce determination of a man who'd finally found something worth dying for. The siege began. At sunset, Benjamin watched from his carefully chosen position behind the overturned kitchen table as Kane's men moved through the gathering shadows like predators closing in on cornered prey. They'd spent the afternoon studying his cabin's defenses, probing for weaknesses while maintaining the pretense of civilized negotiation. Now, with darkness providing cover, their true nature emerged. The first shot shattered the front window, sending glass cascading across the floor in a shower of crystalline fragments. Benjamin had anticipated this, positioning himself where flying debris couldn't reach him while maintaining clear sight lines to the clearing beyond. Last chance. Kane's voice carried across the distance, amplified by the mountain's natural acoustics. Send out the woman and children, and nobody else has to get hurt. Benjamin's response was a carefully aimed rifle shot that splintered the tree trunk inches from where Kane crouched. The message was unmistakable. The mountain man wasn't intimidated by their show of force. What followed was a deadly game of patience and precision that stretched through the long October night. Kane's strategy became clear within the first hour. Rather than risk a direct assault against a prepared defender, he intended to wear Benjamin down through psychological pressure and strategic attrition. One gunman would fire from concealed positions while the other two repositioned, creating the impression of attackers from multiple directions. It was sound tactics for dealing with civilians, but Benjamin's military experience allowed him to read their patterns almost immediately. Each muzzle flash revealed positions. Each movement through the underbrush created opportunities for counterattack. Benjamin had advantages they hadn't anticipated. He knew every tree, rock, and depression on his property. He'd spent 3 years walking these paths in all weather, learning where the shadows fell deepest and which routes offered the best concealment. Most importantly, he was fighting for something infinitely more precious than money or professional reputation. From the back room came the occasional sound of babies stirring, followed immediately by Sarah's gentle voice soothing them back to sleep. She'd barricaded herself and the twins behind his heavy oak dresser, creating a protected space where flying bullets couldn't reach. The knowledge that his family was depending on him filled Benjamin with cold determination that burned steadier than anger. The first casualty occurred near midnight. One of Kane's men had grown overconfident, believing that darkness would mask his approach to the cabin's east wall. Benjamin heard him coming long before seeing him, boots scraping against rocks, clothing catching on low branches, the distinctive sound of someone moving through unfamiliar terrain in poor visibility. Benjamin waited until the figure emerged from shadow into the faint starlight filtering through the trees. The shot was clean, dropping the intruder before he could raise his weapon or cry out a warning. Benjamin immediately changed positions, knowing that muzzle flash would return fire to his previous location. Kane's voice cut through the darkness, tight with professional frustration. "Daniel's report." Silence answered him, stretching long enough for all parties to understand what had happened. Benjamin had drawn first blood, shifting the tactical balance in his favor. "You killed my man," Kane called out, abandoning any pretense of legal authority. "That makes this personal." "Your man was trying to break into my home," Benjamin replied from his new position near the stone fireplace. "I defended it. We'll see how long you can keep that up." What followed was a more intense exchange of gunfire as Kane abandoned caution in favor of aggressive pressure. Bullets whined through the cabin's interior, embedding themselves in walls, furniture, and the thick wooden beams that supported the roof. Benjamin moved constantly, never firing twice from the same location. using his knowledge of the cabin's layout to stay ahead of their attempts to pin him down. Sarah's voice reached him during a brief lull in the shooting, barely audible above. The ringing in his ears. "Benjamin, are you hurt?" "I'm fine," he called back, though his left arm bore a shallow graze from a ricocheting bullet. "Stay down. Keep the girls quiet." "They're sleeping through it," Sarah said, wonder evident in her voice. "I think they feel safe." The simple trust implicit in her words hit Benjamin harder than any of Cain's bullets. These babies, barely 4 months old, slept peacefully while violence raged around them because they believed in their protector's ability to keep them safe. That faith was both humbling and empowering, reminding him what victory would mean and what defeat would cost. Dawn brought a temporary ceasefire as both sides assessed the situation. Cain had lost one man and gained nothing except proof that his opponent was far more dangerous than anticipated. Benjamin had expended roughly half his ammunition while sustaining only minor injuries, but he knew the siege could continue for days if Cain chose persistence over direct action. The tactical situation favored Benjamin in the short term, but Cain in the long run. The cabin's food and water supplies were adequate for a few days, but Cain could resupply from the outside world while Benjamin's resources were strictly limited. As morning light revealed the damage from the night's fighting, Benjamin began implementing the more aggressive phase of his defensive plan. If Cain wanted a war of attrition, he'd discover that mountains could be far more hostile to invaders than he'd anticipated. Benjamin's first move was to circle around behind Cain's position using paths invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. Years of hunting had taught him how to move silently through dense forest, how to use natural features for concealment, how to approach prey without alerting them to danger. Cain had positioned himself in what appeared to be excellent cover, a cluster of large boulders that offered protection from the cabin while providing clear fields of fire. What he hadn't realized was that the position could be flanked using a narrow game trail that wound through thick undergrowth along the ridge's eastern slope. Benjamin's approach took over an hour, moving with the patience of a predator who understood that haste led to mistakes. When he finally had Cain in his rifle sights, the investigator was focused entirely on the cabin, apparently believing his opponent was still trapped inside. "Don't move," Benjamin said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. Cain froze, then slowly turned his head to find Benjamin standing 20 feet away with a rifle aimed at his chest. The investigator's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally grudging respect. "Impressive," Cain said. "I didn't hear you coming. Mountain skills. You wouldn't understand." Cain's remaining companion was positioned somewhere on the opposite side of the clearing, probably wondering why his leader had suddenly gone silent. Benjamin had perhaps minutes before the tactical situation shifted again. "Here's what's going to happen," Benjamin said. "You're going to call off your man, mount up, and ride out of here. You're going to tell Marcus Whitmore that his wife and children died in a landslide, that there's nothing left to recover." Cain shook his head slowly. "Can't do that. Too much money involved. Too much reputation at stake. Whitmore doesn't accept failure. Then you've got a choice to make. Live with failure or die with principle." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across 20 feet of mountain terrain. Cain was calculating odds, looking for advantages, testing Benjamin's resolve. Benjamin simply waited, finger resting lightly on his rifle's trigger. "You know I'm not the only one Whitmore will send," Cain said finally. "Kill me and he'll just hire someone else. Someone who might not be as civilized in their methods. Let me worry about that." Cain nodded slowly, perhaps recognizing something in Benjamin's tone that suggested this conversation was nearing its end. "What about my man? He can collect his friend's body and leave with you. Professional courtesy. And if I refuse? If we decide to finish this right here?" Benjamin's rifle shifted slightly, centering on Kane's chest. "Then you'll discover how seriously I take protecting my family." The word family seemed to surprise Kane, though he quickly masked his reaction. "So that's what this is about. Not just helping a stranger, but defending what you consider yours." "That's exactly what this is about." Kane called out to his remaining companion, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Murphy, show yourself, hands visible." A lean man emerged from concealment near the barn, rifle lowered but ready. He moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that sudden movements could prove fatal. "We're leaving," Kane announced. "Collect Daniels and prepare for departure." Murphy's face showed confusion, but professional discipline prevented him from questioning orders in a tactical situation. He moved toward where his fallen companion lay, keeping his weapons pointed away from Benjamin's position. "This isn't over," Kane said as Murphy gathered the dead man's gear. "Whitmore has long reach and longer memory. He won't forget this." "Neither will I," Benjamin replied. Kane studied him for another moment, perhaps filing away details for a future report. Then he began backing toward his horse, movements slow and deliberate to avoid triggering a violent response. "You're good," he said as he reached his mount. "Better than I expected. But you can't watch every trail, guard every approach. Sooner or later, someone will get through." Benjamin said nothing, maintaining his aim until Kane and Murphy had loaded their fallen companion and begun riding toward the main road. Only when they disappeared beyond the ridge did he lower his rifle and allow himself to breathe normally. The immediate threat was over, but Kane's final words carried the ring of prophecy. Marcus Whitmore wouldn't simply accept defeat and move on. He'd send others, perhaps less professional but more brutal in their methods. The mountain sanctuary Benjamin had built over 3 years of careful isolation was now a target that would draw predators until the source of their interest was permanently eliminated. Benjamin made his way back to the cabin, where Sarah waited with questions in her eyes and babies in her arms. The sight of his family safe and whole sent relief flooding through him, followed immediately by the sobering recognition of what their safety had cost and might cost in the future. "Are they gone?" Sarah asked as he entered, automatically scanning him for injuries, for now. Benjamin set his rifle aside and moved to check the barricaded windows. "But they'll be back. Whitmore won't give up this easily." Sarah nodded, having expected this answer. "What do we do?" Benjamin looked at her holding Emma and Lucy, both babies blissfully unaware of how close they'd come to losing everything. The sight strengthened his resolve while clarifying the choices ahead. "We will prepare for the next time," he said. "And we make sure they understand that some things are worth dying for." Outside, morning sunlight painted the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and serene, as if violence had never touched this peaceful valley. But Benjamin knew that appearances could be deceiving, that beneath the surface calm lay currents of danger that would continue flowing until they reached their final destination. The war for his family's freedom had only just begun, 3 weeks. After Kane's retreat, Benjamin stood in the morning mist outside the Millbrook telegraph office, holding a message that would change everything. The paper trembled slightly in his hands as he read the words that had traveled across hundreds of miles of wire to reach this remote mountain town. Marcus Whitmore, deceased, died suddenly of heart failure, estate in probate, bounty. Rescinded SDO, P. James Reynolds attorney, sent Fiancé Isaac. Benjamin read the message twice more before allowing himself to believe it. Marcus Whitmore, the man whose wealth and connections had turned Sarah into a fugitive, was dead. The immediate threat that had hung over their small family like a storm cloud had dissipated as suddenly as it had formed. The telegram had arrived the previous evening, but Benjamin had waited until morning to retrieve it, wanting to spare Sarah the anxiety of wondering what news it might contain. Now, as he folded the precious paper and tucked it into his coat pocket, He felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. The ride back to his homestead took on the character of a celebration, though Benjamin kept his emotions carefully controlled. Mountain roads still held dangers, and the habits of vigilance that had kept his family safe wouldn't be easily abandoned. But for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to imagine a future without the constant threat of professional killers appearing at his door. Sarah was hanging laundry when he arrived, the twins sleeping peacefully in their basket beneath the oak tree that had become their favorite outdoor nursery. The sight of this domestic tranquility, so normal yet so precious, reminded Benjamin of how much they'd all gained despite the trials they'd endured. "You were gone longer than usual," Sarah observed as he dismounted. "Everything is all right in town?" Benjamin pulled the telegram from his pocket, watching her face as she read the brief message. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, to cautious hope, emotions playing across her features like sunlight through moving clouds. "He's really dead?" she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow reverse the news. "Heart failure, according to his attorney. The bounty's been called off." Benjamin took her hands in his, feeling the tremor that ran through her at this confirmation of their freedom. "You're safe now, Sarah, all of you." Sarah's composure finally cracked, tears flowing down her cheeks as months of accumulated fear and tension found release. Benjamin held her while she wept, offering the comfort of his presence while she processed the magnitude of what had changed. "I don't understand," she said when the tears finally subsided. "Marcus was only 43, strong as an ox. He never showed signs of heart trouble." Benjamin had wondered about the same thing during his ride home. Men in their prime didn't typically die of sudden heart failure without warning signs. But the source of Whitmore's demise mattered less than its consequences, and those consequences were entirely positive for the family that had suffered under his threats. "Sometimes the body gives out when the spirit gets too twisted," Benjamin said. "Maybe all that anger and greed finally caught up with him." Sarah nodded slowly, seeming to accept this explanation. "What happens now to his estate, his business, interests?" "According to the telegram, everything's tied up in probate court. Could take years to sort out, especially if there are competing claims from relatives or business partners." Benjamin smiled grimly. "By the time the lawyers finish fighting over his money, nobody will remember or care about hunting down a missing wife." The implications of their newfound freedom began to sink in as they discussed practical matters. Sarah could reclaim her real name without fear of discovery. The twins could grow up without the shadow of their father's threats hanging over their future. Most importantly, they could build the life they'd been tentatively planning without constantly looking over their shoulders for danger. But freedom, Benjamin realized, brought its own set of challenges. For weeks their shared purpose had been simple survival. Now they needed to decide what kind of life they wanted to build together, what kind of family they wanted to become. That conversation began that evening as they sat on the porch, watching stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The twins were asleep inside, their soft breathing audible through the open door. Ranger lay at Benjamin's feet, finally relaxed after weeks of heightened alert status. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, breaking a comfortable silence. "About what comes next?" Benjamin waited, sensing the importance of whatever she was preparing to say. "For months, I've been running from something, focused entirely on escape. I never really thought about what I was running toward." Sarah's voice carried a note of wonder. "But being here with you, I've started to imagine possibilities I never dared consider before." "What kind of possibilities?" "A real home. A real family. The chance to watch my daughters grow up without fear." Sarah turned to face him. "But I need to know if that's what you want too, or if you're just being kind to people in trouble." Benjamin considered his words carefully. 3 years of solitude had taught him the value of honest communication, but it had also made him cautious about commitments that involved other people's happiness. "When I came back from the war, I thought I was broken beyond repair," he said. "Finally, too damaged to be a good husband, too haunted to be a proper father. I built this place as a refuge where I could heal alone, where my problems wouldn't hurt anyone else." Sarah's expression grew concerned, perhaps fearing rejection disguised as explanation. "But you and the girls changed that," Benjamin continued. "You didn't fix me. I had to do that myself. But you showed me that healing doesn't have to happen in isolation. Sometimes it happens better when you're caring for people who need you." "What are you saying?" Benjamin took her hand, feeling the calluses that had developed during their weeks of shared labor. "I'm saying I don't want to imagine this place without you in it. I want to watch Emma and Lucy take their first steps in that yard. I want to teach them to fish in the creek and ride horses and defend themselves if they ever need to." Sarah's smile was radiant in the starlight. "And what about their mother? What do you want for her?" "I want her to be happy. I want her to feel safe enough to laugh without looking over her shoulder. I want to see what she's like when she's not afraid." Benjamin paused, gathering courage for what he needed to say next. "And if she have me, I want to marry her properly. Not out of convenience or necessity, but because I love her." The words hung in the mountain air between them, simple and profound. Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but these were tears of joy rather than relief. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it." Their first kiss did of hope and new beginnings, sealing promises that went beyond mere survival to encompass the full spectrum of life they could build together. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small church in Millbrook, attended by the few neighbors Benjamin had come to know during his years in the mountains. Sarah wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair that Benjamin had picked that morning. The twins slept through most of the ceremony, waking only to add their voices to the celebration during the final blessing. Reverend Morrison, who'd been skeptical about performing a marriage for a woman with no documented past, had been convinced by Benjamin's obvious devotion and Sarah's gentle dignity. The community, once they understood the basic story of rescue and protection, embraced the new family with the warmth that small towns reserved for tales of triumph over adversity. But the most meaningful moment came during the exchange of vows, when Benjamin promised to love and protect not just Sarah, but also Emma and Lucy as if they were his own daughters. The words weren't required by tradition or law, but they reflected a truth that had grown from shared danger into unshakable commitment. After the ceremony, they returned to the homestead that was now officially their family home. Benjamin had spent the previous weeks making improvements, expanding the cabin to include a proper nursery, building a larger porch where the growing family could gather in the evenings, constructing play areas where the twins could safely explore. As they grew older, the property itself had been transformed by Sarah's presence and planning. Gardens now flourished where once there had been only wilderness. Chickens provided fresh eggs daily. The interior of the cabin reflected a woman's touch while maintaining the sturdy practicality that mountain life demanded. Most importantly, the place felt alive in ways it never had during Benjamin's years of solitude. Children's laughter, still, mostly just happy babbling from the twins, echoed from the meadows. Conversations filled the long winter evenings. The future stretched ahead, filled with possibilities rather than empty repetition. 3 months after Marcus Whitmore's death, a letter arrived from his attorney providing the final closure their story needed. The estate had been settled with most assets going to pay debts and legal fees. A cousin in Missouri had inherited what remained of the business, showing no interest in pursuing Marcus's personal vendettas. More importantly, the letter officially confirmed Sarah's freedom from any legal claims. She was no longer a fugitive wife, but a widow who'd remarried, her past transformed from liability to tragic backstory that only enhanced her current happiness. "It's really over," Sarah said after reading the letter aloud. "All of it. Marcus. The threats, the running, we're truly free. Benjamin nodded, feeling the satisfaction of a job completed. Free to build whatever kind of life we want. That life was already taking shape around them. Emma had begun crawling, exploring every corner of the cabin with fearless curiosity. Lucy preferred to observe the world from safe positions, watching. Her sister's adventures with alert intelligence that suggested different, but equally strong personality traits. Sarah had started a small business sewing and mending clothes for families in Millbrook, using skills learned in her father's mercantile to supplement their household income. Benjamin's carpentry work had expanded as word spread about his craftsmanship, bringing steady income and regular contact with the broader community. But the most significant change was harder to quantify: the sense of belonging, of purpose, of lives interconnected in ways that created something larger than the sum of their parts. Benjamin was no longer a damaged veteran hiding from the world, but a husband and father whose family depended on his strength and wisdom. Sarah was no longer a frightened fugitive, but a woman building the life she'd always dreamed of having. The Parenduzo no longer a frightened fugitive, but a woman building the life she'd always dreamed of having. Twins who would grow up knowing nothing of the danger that had marked their early months, would inherit a legacy of courage and determination that would serve them well in whatever challenges life might bring. As winter approached their first year together, Benjamin often found himself standing on his porch in the evening, looking out over the valley that held everything he'd ever wanted. The mountain peaks still stood sentinel around their home, but they no longer felt like barriers keeping the world at bay. Instead, they were guardians protecting something precious, a family that had been forged in adversity and tempered by love into something unbreakable. The wagon where he'd first discovered Sarah and her babies still sat near the barn, now used for hauling supplies and materials for the family's growing enterprises. Sometimes Benjamin would pause beside it, remembering that October night when everything had changed. A moment of discovery that had transformed 4 separate lives into one unified story. The hunt was over. The family was safe. The future belonged to them, shaped by their choices rather than their fears. And in the quiet moments between sunset and full darkness, when the mountain air carried the sounds of his daughter's laughter and his wife's gentle voice, Benjamin Carter knew he'd finally found what he'd been searching for without even knowing he was looking. Home, family, peace, earned through courage and preserved through love. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter echoed across the Carter homestead as Emma and Lucy raced through the wildflower meadow, their golden hair streaming behind them like banners in the summer breeze. Benjamin paused in his work of building an addition to the barn, watching his daughters with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd learned to treasure ordinary miracles. At 6 years old, the twins had developed into distinctly different personalities, while maintaining the unbreakable bond that seemed to define all twins. Emma remained the adventurer, fearless in her exploration of every tree, creek, and hidden corner of their mountain property. Lucy had grown into the family's philosopher, preferring to observe and understand before acting, but possessing a fierce protective instinct when anyone threatened her sister. "Papa, Papa, come see what we found." Emma's voice carried across the meadow with the urgency that children reserved for discoveries adults might not immediately appreciate. Benjamin set down his tools and followed the sound of excited chatter to where his daughters crouched beside the creek that marked the eastern boundary of their property. Lucy held something cupped carefully in her small hands, while Emma danced with impatience nearby. "Look!" Lucy opened her hands to reveal a tiny bird, barely old enough to have proper feathers. It fell from its nest up there. She pointed to an oak branch high overhead. Emma wanted to climb up and put it back, but I said we should ask you first. Benjamin knelt beside his daughters, examining the helpless creature with the same careful attention he'd once devoted to military reconnaissance. The bird was uninjured, but clearly too young to survive. On its own, if returned to a nest, it had probably been pushed from by stronger siblings. "What do you think we should do?" he asked, a question that had become his standard response to the children's discoveries. Sarah had taught him that answers imposed from above carried less weight than conclusions reached through guided reasoning. "We could make it a nest in the barn," Emma suggested. "Feed it until it's big enough to fly away." "But what if its mama is looking for it?" Lucy countered. "She might be sad if she can't find her baby." Benjamin smiled at the compassion both girls showed, even as they wrestled with the practical challenges of helping wild creatures. These moments of moral reasoning gave him more pride than any of his carpentry projects or successful harvests. "Sometimes baby birds fall from nests because nature is making hard choices," he explained gently. "The parent birds might not be able to feed all their babies, so the strongest ones survive." "That's not fair," Emma said with the absolute certainty that 6-year-olds brought to questions of justice. "No, it's not fair, but it's how nature works. Our job isn't to change that, but to decide how we want to respond to it." Lucy looked down at the bird in her hands, thinking carefully. "If we try to save it, it might die anyway. But if we don't try, it will definitely die. And trying is better than not trying," Emma added. Understanding her sister's logic, Benjamin nodded approvingly. "So what's our plan?" The next hour was spent constructing an elaborate rescue operation. The girls gathered soft materials for a makeshift nest while Benjamin prepared a mixture of water and cornmeal that might substitute for the insects the bird would normally eat. They set up their patient in the barn, far enough from Ranger to avoid scaring it but close enough to monitor its progress. "Will it live?" Lucy asked as they watched the tiny creature accept its first feeding. "I don't know," Benjamin answered honestly. "But we're giving it the best chance we can. Sometimes that's all anyone can do." Sarah appeared in the barn doorway, wiping her hands on her apron after finishing the preparations for their evening meal. At 31, she'd grown into the confident woman she'd always had the potential to become, her earlier fearfulness replaced by the quiet strength that came from knowing she was loved and protected. "Another rescue project?" she asked, though. Her tone suggested amusement rather than exasperation. "Emma and Lucy found a baby bird," Benjamin explained. "We're seeing if love and attention can substitute for whatever it lost." Sarah's expression softened as she understood the deeper meaning behind his words. Their entire family had been built on the premise that love and attention could heal wounds that seemed impossible to overcome. "Supper's ready when you are," she said, "and we have something to discuss with the girls." Benjamin caught the meaningful look she gave him and felt his heart rate quicken. They'd been talking about expanding their family, but Sarah had wanted to be certain before sharing the news with Emma and Lucy. They gathered around the kitchen table that Benjamin had built from oak trees on their own property, a solid piece of furniture that had become the center of their family's daily rituals. The twins chattered excitedly about their rescue bird, while Sarah served bowls of venison stew and freshly baked bread. "Girls," Sarah said when the initial excitement had settled, "Papa and I have something important to tell you." Emma and Lucy immediately gave their parents full attention, the serious tone indicating this was grown-up news rather than ordinary household announcements. "You're going to have a baby brother or sister," Benjamin said, watching their faces. For reactions, the twins exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes before Emma spoke first. "When?" "This winter, probably around Christmas," Sarah replied. "The baby will be very small at first, like that bird you found today. It will need lots of care and attention." "Will we have to help take care of it?" Lucy asked. "Only if you want to," Benjamin said. "Being a big sister is a choice, not an obligation. But if we don't help, who will?" Emma demanded with the logical precision that often caught adults off guard. "Mama and I will. But babies do better when they're surrounded by people who love them." The more family they have, the stronger they grow. Lucy nodded solemnly, like how Emma and I are stronger together than apart. Exactly like that. The conversation continued through supper as the twins processed this momentous news. Their questions revealed both excitement and concern, the natural response of children who'd been the center of their parents' attention suddenly facing the prospect of sharing that attention with someone new, but gradually as they discussed the practical aspects of preparing for a new baby, Benjamin saw their initial uncertainty transform into protective enthusiasm. Emma began planning all the things she would teach the baby about climbing trees and catching fish. Lucy started designing quiet activities they could share when the baby needed gentle entertainment. After the girls were asleep, Benjamin and Sarah sat on their expanded porch, watching stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The addition he'd built to their original cabin now provided space for a growing family while maintaining the cozy intimacy that had marked their early days together. They took it well, Sarah observed, her hand resting on the slight curve of her belly that would soon become much more pronounced. They're good kids. We raised them to think about others, not just themselves. Sarah smiled at his use of we, though they both knew she'd been the primary influence on the twins' moral development. Benjamin's contributions had been more practical, teaching them self-reliance, problem-solving, and the kind of quiet courage that faced difficulties without complaint. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "About starting over with a baby?" Benjamin considered the question seriously. The prospect of caring for an infant again, of sleepless nights and constant vigilance, should have been daunting for a man approaching 50. But the thought filled him with anticipation rather than dread. Excited, more than nervous, we know what we're doing now. We know what kind of parents we want to be. And what kind is that? The kind who protect without smothering. Who teach independence while providing security. Who love unconditionally while still setting boundaries. Benjamin paused, thinking about his own childhood and the lessons he'd learned from watching other families succeed or fail. The kind who remember that children are individuals, not possessions. It was an indirect reference to Marcus Whitmore and his view of the twins as property to be disposed of according to his convenience. That shadow had finally faded completely from their lives, but its memory served as a reminder of what children deserved and what they should never have to endure. The seasons that followed brought changes that tested and strengthened their family bonds. Sarah's pregnancy progressed smoothly, but it required adjustments to their household routines that affected everyone. Emma and Lucy rose to the challenge with remarkable maturity, taking on additional responsibilities without being asked and showing genuine concern for their mother's well-being. Benjamin found himself marveling at how naturally the girls had accepted their expanded roles. They helped with cooking, took over some of the household chores that were becoming difficult for Sarah, and even began helping with his carpentry projects when their schoolwork was finished. The local school had been established 3 years earlier, with Benjamin serving on the board that hired teachers and set curriculum standards. Emma and Lucy walked the 2 miles to town each morning, part of a small group of farm children who'd formed their own protective community for the daily journey. Their teacher, Miss Henderson, had praised both girls for their academic progress and social development. Emma excelled in arithmetic and natural sciences, while Lucy showed exceptional ability in reading and writing. But both were noted for their kindness toward younger children and their willingness to help classmates who struggled with lessons. Benjamin took particular pride in their reputations as peacemakers rather than troublemakers. In a small community where children's behavior reflected on their families, the twins had become ambassadors for the values their parents had tried to instill. The baby arrived on December 22nd, during a snowstorm that trapped them in their cabin. For 3 days, Sarah's labor was difficult but manageable, with Benjamin serving as midwife based on knowledge he'd gained during wartime medical emergencies. Their son entered the world with a lusty cry that announced his intention to be heard, a trait that would define his personality from that first moment. They named him Samuel, after Sarah's beloved father, with the middle name Thomas in honor of Benjamin's military mentor, who'd taught him that courage meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Emma and Lucy's first meeting with their baby brother set the tone for relationships that would endure throughout their lives. Emma immediately proclaimed herself his chief protector, while Lucy appointed herself his primary entertainer. Between the two of them, Samuel would never lack for attention or advocates. Watching his expanded family gather around the new baby, Benjamin felt a completion he hadn't known he was seeking. The damaged veteran who'd retreated to the mountains to heal had become the patriarch of a thriving household that represented everything good about human resilience and love. The wagon where he'd first discovered Sarah and the twins had been converted into a children's playhouse, painted bright colors and filled with toys and books. Sometimes Benjamin would find all three children there, Emma reading stories to Lucy and Samuel, their voices creating the kind of harmony that could only exist when people truly belonged together. Years passed with the measured rhythm of family life, birthdays and holidays, scraped knees and academic achievements, the gradual transformation of babies into children and children into young adults. Emma grew into a fearless explorer who could track deer through dense forest and construct elaborate tree houses with minimal adult supervision. Lucy developed into a thoughtful scholar who read everything she could find and wrote stories that captured the essence of mountain life with surprising sophistication. Samuel proved to be a bridge between his sister's different temperaments, possessing Emma's physical courage and Lucy's intellectual curiosity in equal measure. By the time he could walk, he was following both sisters on their various adventures, learning from each according to his interests and abilities. Benjamin's carpentry business had expanded to include furniture making and house construction throughout the territory. His reputation for honest work and fair dealing brought customers from as far away as Portland, providing prosperity that allowed the family to plan for the children's education and future opportunities. Sarah had established herself as the community's unofficial medical advisor, her knowledge of herbs and healing techniques making her invaluable during emergencies when the nearest doctor was days away. Her gentle manner and practical wisdom had earned respect that transcended her origins as a mysterious stranger who'd arrived with no past and uncertain prospects. But perhaps the most significant measure of their success was the way their home had become a gathering place for neighbors and travelers who needed assistance or simply wanted to experience the warmth of a family that had learned to value what truly mattered. On Samuel's 5th birthday, as Benjamin watched his son blow out candles while surrounded by sisters who adored him and parents who built their entire world around love rather than fear, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A wagon, a desperate woman, twin babies who needed protection. A series of choices that had transformed 4 separate lives into something beautiful and enduring. The mountain peaks still stood sentinel around their valley, but they no longer felt like barriers or refuges. They were simply home, the place where a family had learned that love multiplied rather than divided, that strength came from helping others rather than conquering them, and that the greatest adventures were the ones shared with people who mattered. As evening settled over their homestead and the children's laughter faded into contented sleepiness, Benjamin Carter knew he'd finally found what every person searches for, but few ever discover: a life worth living, surrounded by people worth protecting, in a place where every sunrise brought new possibilities instead of old fears. The hunt was over. The family was complete. The story would continue for generations, carried forward by children who'd learned that love was the strongest foundation and courage the most valuable inheritance. In the end, that was everything that mattered, everything that lasted, everything that made the journey worthwhile. 25 years after that fateful October night when Benjamin Carter first lifted the canvas flap of his wagon, The mountain valley had transformed into something he could never have imagined. The simple homestead had grown into a thriving ranch that sprawled across 300 acres of prime Oregon Territory land, its success built on the foundation of hard work, family values, and the kind of reputation that money couldn't buy. Benjamin, now 66 with silver threading through his dark hair and lines of laughter carved deep around his eyes, stood on the wraparound porch of the grand house he'd built to replace their original cabin. The structure was a masterpiece of frontier architecture, combining practical mountain design with elegant touches that reflected the prosperity the Carter family had achieved through decades of careful planning and honest business practices. Below him in the valley, his grandson played in the same meadow where Emma and Lucy had once chased butterflies and rescued fallen birds. Little Marcus, named for the man whose death had freed their family, in a gesture of forgiveness that had taken Sarah years to embrace, was the image of his grandfather Samuel at that age, all boundless energy and fearless curiosity. The irony of the name hadn't been lost on anyone in the family. Sarah's decision to honor even the darkest part of their history had been her way of claiming complete victory over the past that had once threatened to destroy them. By naming their grandson after Marcus Whitmore, she'd transformed him from a symbol of fear into a reminder of how love could triumph over hatred. Papa Benjamin, the 5-year-old, came running up the hill, his face flushed with excitement. Mama Lucy says the new foal is ready to meet people. Can we go see? Benjamin smiled at the title that had evolved naturally as the family expanded. He was Papa to his own children, but Papa Benjamin to the growing collection of grandchildren, who'd made his later years an adventure in patience and joy. Let's go see this foal, he agreed, allowing himself to be pulled by the hand toward the expanded barn complex that now housed 20 horses, 50 head of cattle, and an assortment of other animals that served both practical and sentimental purposes. Lucy, now 31 and the mother of 3 children, looked remarkably like her mother had at that age. She'd inherited Sarah's gentle strength and Benjamin's practical intelligence, combining them into a personality that made her the natural peacemaker in any situation. Her husband, Dr. James Morrison, son of the Reverend who'd married Benjamin, and Sarah, had established the region's first proper medical practice, with Lucy serving as his unofficial partner in treating everything from difficult births to hunting accidents. She's beautiful, isn't she? Lucy said as they approached the stall where a chestnut Mari nuzzled her hours-old foal. Emma thinks we should call her Sunrise because of the timing. Emma had arrived the previous evening with her own family, making the monthly journey from Portland, where her husband operated a lumber mill that supplied building materials throughout the Pacific Northwest. At 31, Emma had grown into the fearless entrepreneur Benjamin had always known she would become, though motherhood had tempered her adventurous spirit with the wisdom that came from being responsible for other lives. "Where is your sister?" Benjamin asked, noting Emma's absence from what should have been a family gathering. "Dealing with a crisis at the mill," Lucy replied with the fond exasperation that marked their adult relationship. "A shipment got delayed. And you know, Emma, she won't trust anyone else to handle the important problems." Benjamin nodded, recognizing the trait because he'd seen it in himself during his younger years. The need to personally oversee every detail, to maintain control through direct involvement, was both a strength and a weakness that could either build empires or destroy them through exhaustion. Samuel emerged from the house carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd just finished a substantial breakfast. At 26, he'd grown into the perfect synthesis of his sister's different qualities, Emma's courage and Lucy's thoughtfulness, combined with a natural leadership ability that made people instinctively trust his judgment. He'd recently been elected to the territorial legislature, the youngest representative in Oregon's history, on a platform of responsible development that balanced economic growth with environmental protection. His speeches about the importance of preserving the wilderness that had shaped their family's character had earned him attention from newspapers as far away as San Francisco. "Any word from Emma about when she'd be back?" Samuel asked, joining the group around the foal's stall. "She said noon at the latest," Lucy replied. "She wants to be here for Mama's announcement." Benjamin felt his heart skip slightly at the mention of an announcement. At 56, Sarah remained the emotional center of their extended family, the person everyone turned to for advice, comfort, and the kind of wisdom that could only come from having survived genuine hardship and emerged stronger. But lately, he'd noticed signs that concerned him. She tired more easily than before, sometimes forgot details that would once have been automatic, and had developed a cough that persisted despite Lucy's medical attention. The possibility that she might be dealing with serious health problems was something Benjamin tried not to contemplate, though the fear lurked constantly in the back of his mind. "What kind of announcement?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "The good kind," Sarah's voice came from behind them, warm with the amusement that always marked her interactions with her worried husband. "The kind that makes families grow rather than shrink." Benjamin turned to see his wife approaching with a bundle of letters in her hand and a smile that suggested news worth celebrating. Even after 25 years of marriage, the sight of her still had the power to make his breath catch slightly. Age had marked her with silver hair and gentle lines, but it had also brought a confidence and contentment that made her more beautiful than the frightened young woman he'd first discovered in his wagon. "What are you talking about?" Samuel asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Emma's pregnant," Sarah announced, her voice carrying the joy that grandchildren always brought to the Carter household. The letter arrived this morning. She wanted to tell everyone in person, but the milk crisis made that impossible. The news sent a wave of celebration through the small group gathered around the foal. Little Marcus began jumping up and down with excitement, though Benjamin suspected the child didn't fully understand what he was celebrating. Lucy clapped her hands together with delight, while Samuel broke into the broad grin that had charmed voters throughout the territory. "How far along?" Lucy asked with the professional interest of someone who'd assisted at dozens of births. 3 months, according to her letter. "She's feeling well, no complications so far." Sarah's expression grew slightly concerned, though she's worried about managing the mill business while carrying a baby. "She'll figure it out," Benjamin said with the confidence that came from watching Emma overcome every challenge life had presented. "She always does." The conversation continued as they made their way back to the main house, but Benjamin found his attention drifting to the broader landscape of their valley. Every building, every fence line, every carefully tended field represented years of shared labor and common purpose. This wasn't just a ranch or a business enterprise. It was a legacy built by people who understood that true wealth came from relationships rather than bank accounts. The original cabin where they'd started their life together had been preserved as a kind of family shrine, though it now served as a guest house for visiting relatives and friends. The wagon that had brought Sarah and the twins into his life sat nearby, restored to pristine condition and used for special occasions like harvest festivals and wedding ceremonies. Sometimes Benjamin would sit in that wagon on quiet evenings, remembering the night when everything had changed. The frightened young woman clutching 2 babies, the careful negotiations that had led to trust, the gradual recognition that they needed each other in ways none of them had initially understood. Those memories were precious now, not just for 2P, their personal significance, but for what they represented about human resilience and the power of love to transform even the most desperate circumstances into something beautiful. The extended family gathered for their traditional Sunday dinner. Around the massive oak table that Benjamin had crafted to accommodate the growing number of Carters. Emma had arrived just as the meal was being served, her face glowing with the particular radiance that early pregnancy brought to some women. She announced her news officially over dessert, though everyone already knew what she was going to say. The formal sharing was followed by toasts, plans for the baby's arrival, and the kind of warm family chaos that had become the soundtrack of Benjamin's later years. But it was the quiet conversation after dinner, when the dishes were cleared and the grandchildren were playing in the parlor, that revealed the deeper currents running through their family's evolution. "I've been thinking about the future," Samuel said as the adults settled into comfortable chairs around the fireplace. "About what kind of world we're building for the next generation. What kind of thoughts?" Benjamin asked, recognizing the serious tone that usually preceded important discussions. "The territory's changing fast. More people arriving every month. New businesses, new towns. In 10 years, this place might not look anything like what we remember." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "The mill's doing well because there's so much construction happening. But James worries about what happens when we run out of old-growth timber. What do we do when the easy resources are gone?" "We adapt," Sarah said simply. "The same way we've always adapted. We figure out how to build something sustainable instead of just taking what's convenient." Lucy leaned forward in her chair. "Samuel's been talking about conservation laws, haven't you? Ways to protect the wilderness areas while still allowing responsible development." "It's complicated," Samuel admitted. "People want jobs and prosperity, but they also want to preserve what makes Oregon special. Finding the balance isn't easy." Benjamin listened to his children discuss challenges he was only beginning to understand. The isolation that had once protected their family was disappearing as civilization crept steadily into the mountains. Roads were being improved, telegraph lines extended, railroad surveyors mapping routes that would connect their remote valley to markets hundreds of miles away. Progress was inevitable, but it didn't have to be destructive. The values that had built their family, hard work, mutual respect, long-term thinking, could be applied to larger problems if enough people were willing to make the effort. "What do you think, Papa?" Emma asked, using the childhood title that none of his children had ever outgrown. "How do we protect what matters while still growing and changing?" Benjamin considered the question, thinking about the lessons that 25 years of mountain life had taught him. The answer, when it came, felt both simple and profound. "We remember that the best things in life aren't things at all," he said. "Finally, they're relationships, community, the knowledge that you can depend on the people around you when trouble comes." He gestured toward the family gathered around the fireplace, his wife, his children, his grandchildren, the collection of people who'd become his entire world. None of this happened by accident. It happened because people made choices, sometimes hard choices, to put family and community ahead of personal convenience. That's what we teach the next generation. Not just how to make money or build businesses, but how to build lives worth living. Sarah reached over and took his hand, her touch carrying the weight of shared history and common purpose. "The wagon's still out there," she said quietly. "Sometimes I look at it and remember how scared I was that first night. How certain I was that nothing good could ever happen to us." "What changed your mind?" Little Marcus asked from his position on the floor, where he'd been playing with wooden toys, but apparently listening to the adult conversation. Sarah smiled down at her grandson. "I learned that being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing even when you are scared. And I learned that families aren't just about blood. They're about people who choose to take care of each other." The conversation continued as evening settled over the valley, touching on everything from territorial politics to family traditions to plans for the coming harvest season. But the underlying theme remained constant, the recognition that they'd built something precious together, something worth preserving and passing on to future generations. As the family prepared to retire for the night, Benjamin made his customary walk around the property, checking gates and ensuring that all was secure. It was an old habit from his military days, refined by years of ranch management, but it served a deeper purpose now. These evening walks gave him time to process the day's events, to appreciate the magnitude of what they'd accomplished, and to plan for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. Tonight, as he paused beside the restored wagon that had started everything, Benjamin felt the profound satisfaction that came from a life well lived. The frightened veteran who'd hidden in these mountains had grown into a patriarch, whose family represented everything good about the American frontier spirit. The babies who'd slept in his wagon that first night had become accomplished adults raising children of their own. The desperate fugitive he'd protected had evolved into the matriarch of a family that stretched across 3 generations and multiple successful enterprises. Most importantly, they'd proven that love really could conquer fear, that courage could triumph over cruelty, and that the choices people made in moments of crisis could echo through decades of happiness and prosperity. As Benjamin headed back toward the house, where lamplight glowed warmly in the windows and the sounds of his family preparing for sleep created a symphony of contentment, he whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude for that October night, when everything had changed. The wagon had brought him a family. The family had given his life meaning, and that meaning would endure long after he was gone, carried forward by children and grandchildren who understood that the greatest legacy wasn't wealth or property, but the knowledge that love was always stronger than fear. In the distance, an owl called through the mountain darkness, its voice carrying the same wild beauty that had first drawn Benjamin to these peaks. But now that wildness was balanced by the warmth of home, the comfort of belonging, and the unshakable knowledge that some things, the most important things, would last forever. The story that had begun with a desperate woman and her babies would continue through generations yet unborn, each chapter building on the foundation of courage, love, and unwavering commitment to family that had sustained them through every trial. And somewhere in the future, when the children of children's children gathered around their own fires to share family stories, they would remember the night when Papa Benjamin found Mama Sarah sleeping in a wagon with twin babies, and how that moment of compassion had changed everything that came after. The legacy was secure. The love would endure. The family would continue. Forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.